So good morning, everyone, and welcome to everyone who's here with us today. I'm Tirmini, and I'm going to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Sarah Lambert. She's from Deakin University, and you're actually going to find her presentation very interesting, especially how she addresses the need for OER and textbook in higher education. One of her co-presenters is not able to join us, but I'll just leave the way now to Sarah to present her research project on textbook, and also she'll be having some questions in between for the audience, and you'll be able to participate in the session. And we're going to have the last 5 minutes for Q&As, and I'll join back then.
Hi there, everyone. It's great to be here. And before I start to talk about the Australian Open Textbook Project, I'd really like to know who's in the room and whether you've had a chance to teach or even write an open textbook. So if you can chuck some comments in where you're from, and if you have used an open textbook, what's the topic or the title of the book would be a proxy for that. So let's get that going while I fire up my slideshow and get this party started. All right. Now, so I think I'm just going to do it a little bit differently and just share my screen without going full screen, because I've only got the one screen and I don't want to lose the comments just yet. So let's see how we go. All right. Here I am. So yeah, Open to Diversity, Inclusive Design Insights from the Australian OER Textbook Project. And I want to give a shout out for my research assistant, the fabulous Habiba Fadel, who couldn't be with us today, but has been a huge part of making this project. And so, yeah, so we're going to definitely see who's in the chat and what your textbook experience is. So let's just get started and see how we go. So what is this project about? Well, we wanted to find out to what extent do OER texts have the potential to act as social justice initiatives in Australian higher education as they do overseas. And so to answer that question, we had a 12-month project. And so we did 64 interviews. 19 students we interviewed at 2 different unis, and that was a mix of both masters and undergraduate, local and international, sort of 50-50, which is great. And they were 45-minute in-depth interviews. And similarly, we interviewed 45 staff, this time at 5 different Australian universities, and that covered not only staff, institutional support staff in libraries, e-learning, and also leadership and policy, but OER adopters and authors. And there was a national online survey of teaching staff as well. So, yes, let's go. Here we go. So this is continuing with some really interesting research. It's part of a global conversation about widening access and success for historically underrepresented learners in higher education. And my working life has been a lot of working in regional, big regional teaching and research institutions where they have a real mixture, a real diverse student population, regional, local, and mature age, online, blended, and international. So with this particular funding approach, it was a social justice focused piece of research, and that approach evaluates the impact of initiatives in terms of the way that learners who by circumstance have less are able to be provided with more resources, certainly, but also more recognition or more representation. And those latter 2 components of the social justice spectrum ended up being quite interesting and important for this study. And so in terms of research that we're building on, I want to give a shout out to this particular episode episodes. The TV theme is seeped in here, but it's a special collection of JIME devoted to open education and social justice. A great episode there, launched in May last year. International contributions, lots of good stuff there. And so, yes, so the representation piece of diversity and social justice was important for this study, and also the recognition piece. And so we ended up talking with students and staff about how, if it's important to diversify the contents inside the textbook to make it more representative of the student population, and also what that looked like, and who was doing that kind of activity. And so this graphic is something we developed to try and express this idea of open textbooks being not just about the free component, which is important for sure, but also, why is there nobody like me in the whole textbook? And that being something we wanted to look at. And indeed, from the very first student interview, this turned out to be something that students were caring about to different degrees and different levels of awareness. But this is a quote from the first student interview. It's towards the end, we're talking about representation a lot and who's represented and why that's important. And they said, it's just important to represent people because you're not just in a gated community of white straight people, which I thought was absolutely amazing. And a quote of not just a gated community of white straight people is something that sat with me all through the project. And so this is a student who didn't feel that they were particularly included in some things, yes, in some things and not in others. And that sense of belonging is something that equity research is increasingly interested in. There's quite a lot of work on the importance of students' sense of belonging on campus with classes, and there's some evidence to show that a lack of belonging impedes study and increases anxiety and depression, and that was a fairly recent major study here in Australia. So that sense of mental health, belonging, ability to study. So, but what about inclusion in terms of in the curriculum and in the readings? And that's something that we're interested in with this. So extending the sense of belonging to curriculum and readings, seeing yourself in the materials is important for belonging, and reducing the feelings of not belonging experienced by first-gen students. This was a study actually by Amy Nussbaum in the JIME special edition that I mentioned previously. So we're trying to extend and build on this type of work. And from those interviews, when we were talking and asking the students who's missing from their texts, here's some quotes. Let's just go through them. Well, barely women are mentioned. It's all about the men. Even the textbook for retail management, which is a female-dominated workforce, did not have women visible in it. Business texts, said another, generally have men, and men again. And another, I don't know, black people or different religious people are, for example, missing in business communication. And I think the significant person that textbook needs is Nelson Mandela. So here's a student being very particular about who was notably absent from a book in business communications. And many people talked about the lack of Indigenous people and Indigenous communities in texts, and also the lack of gay people. And this was sort of couched in terms of being, but I wasn't expecting that. And I found that really, I reflected on that a lot. There was a sense of that wasn't, they were used to being excluded, and so why would a textbook be different? And I thought that was just very sad, and it's really sat with me as well. And I think that we can, and many of the academics we spoke to were really alive to those issues and wanted to do better. But similarly, who's speaking, who's writing, who's authoring, who is seen as an expert in the textbooks. I noticed the men's names always seem to come first, and they always look very Anglo, the names. So no, they're not very multicultural. So there isn't a lot of diversity in the authors. And one student said in the sociology one as well, it's all old white guys from 100 years ago, which is a bit priceless, isn't it? So the students were alive to these kinds of issues of representation and getting a sense that it wasn't very representative, I suppose. And so sometimes, though, the students weren't as comfortable talking about complete they were framing what they saw in the textbooks as about undervaluing different contributions. So this student said that I do feel that business is a kind of male-dominated field, especially the finance field. So I do feel like there have been examples that have been, they don't want to exclude females, but they do not recognize them as well, kind of like that. And that was really interesting to see the nuances that students could sense, that it was that they had ticked a box, they had put some women in the books, but they weren't really giving them their due recognition in the same way as they did to the men who they were presenting there. And of course, there were examples of really good texts, of inclusive texts, but those were framed both by students and staff as exceptions to the rule. And they gave normally just a single example. One author who had had a go at writing a more inclusive text for a particular discipline said that was, the way they had done that was quite unusual. But there was, I think, a lot of time in the project where our interviewees were talking about reading lists, not just textbooks. And in Australia, reading lists where there's a curated list of things is really quite common. And in some disciplines, it is absolutely the norm. And that sense of an inclusive reading list was discussed quite a lot. And I think there's definitely the case that academics are compiling these things, pulling things from here and there. And part of the reason is to get some diversity in. And so I want to stop sharing my whole screen and just ask for some feedback at this point from the participants. Have you tried auditing your reading lists or your textbooks for diversity, for gender or racial representation, for example, or any other kind of diversity? Now I'm coming back to the presentation here, and I'm hoping I can see in the comments what's happening. So wow, we've got some people in the comments here, and yeah, wow, okay, in music theory, wow, that's interesting. Oh, okay, so Louise says she has, but it was a bit of a shock. I wonder what she found that was missing there. That's really interesting. How are we going? Is there anyone who had a go and then made a change, perhaps? Oh, a challenge. Very good. Someone's going to have a crack. That's great. Yes, I have someone in nutrition intentionally adapting a textbook for this reason. Great. Okay. Fantastic. So for some a challenge and some definitely on there, which is exciting. That's great. All right. Well, let's yeah. Prospectus. Lots of young men with beards. They're normally lolling on lawns with laptops, I find, as well, aren't they? Even if that's not what happens in campuses much anymore. Never mind. All right, let me come back and share my screen again. All right, let's go. So, here we go. So yeah, we found in this study that Australian staff were definitely active and interested in diversification of the content of their readings or their texts. Lots of good examples. Curation of more diverse and inclusive reading lists, some intentionally curating those as fully open access. Adoption of OER as bringing the text up to date, and authoring of more inclusive textbooks, both OER and commercial, as being something that staff were actively doing. And our survey data suggested, which was from a broader population of people recruited very widely, suggested that, 2/3 and above were really interested in adapting open texts, not only for the Australian context, but also for diversifying that content, which was higher than we had anticipated. Here's an example of someone who does this as part of their pre-semester prep. I'm careful to select images and examples in the content I produce that represents different people with different cultural, religious, and gender sexual identities. Where possible, I also make sure the readings I curate for a subject are written by diverse groups of people, not all white men. I actively exclude learning materials if they're not appropriately representative of differences in the population. I tend to rely on scholarship written by Indigenous experts as readings when it's required, and I've also drawn on multimedia resources where Indigenous people speak about an issue relevant to them. And I think there was a lot of conversation about Indigenous recognition of and knowledges in the interviews, but a growing sense that there was increasingly more material that you could put forward, so we could just rely on actual Indigenous people speaking about their experience rather than trying to speak for them, and that was politically and ethically very important. But one of these key findings is that many academics interviewed were motivated to adopt OER as a way of getting a more up-to-date text. And for some of those academics, having better Indigenous, multicultural, and gender representation was part of what made the text up-to-date. So this sounds like a no-brainer in retrospect, but the connection between OER up-to-datedness and diversification of the content was not something that we immediately connected at the start of the research. And so, as a quote from a colleague who was really motivated to get into OER because his area is fast moving. The unit I was interested in drawing on an open access textbook was using a commercial text published in 2012. It's out of date. It lacks a number of elements, including Indigenous education. It lacks focus on the curriculum. There is a great opportunity with OER text to pick up a resource that grows with the knowledge of the field. And also it was screen reader friendly, which was super important for Ben, who uses screen readers all the time. And so there was also a connection between diversifying the text, improving the graduate outcomes from staff and from students. So staff felt that those texts or reading lists that portrayed a wider variety of perspectives and knowledges would better prepare students for the workplace. And some students interviewed who had experienced both the traditional unit versus one with a diverse reading list, inclusive of Indigenous, Black and female authors. Those classes modelled and practiced how those points of view contrasted and supplemented the kinds of knowledges coming from more traditional and indeed often older sources, and students preferred that. And they said that the points of view presented would assist them to be better teachers, nurses and counsellors, which is super important. And so last question then, how is diversity linked to up-to-datedness in your field? Let me stop sharing and come back to the comments there. And let me see what you think about up-to-datedness and diversity in the field that you're into. Catherine, yes, once you see the lack of diversity, it's impossible not to see it. It's so true. It's something you just can't unsee, and it starts to grow. Is there anyone who is thinking about the discipline they work in is having a conversation about this up-to-datedness factor?
We actually now approaching the start of we in the Q&A. So if you would like to ask some questions to Sarah, we've got Mark who's asking, how do we use the open textbook movement to help reframe what we define as text? Student as authors rather than audience is one avenue for development. How you explored this in this video? And if I may add one more question to you, Sarah, is what do you think would be the next step now to prove, not to prove, but also to take your data and show to all these decision makers that yes, we need to go more and more for OER textbook, especially given the pandemic, what it showed us, and the widening gap of poverty and all. So if you could take Mark's question and then your thoughts on mine, and then we'll take some more questions.
Yeah, so definitely we very quickly had to scope the research to include reading lists. That was absolutely clear because there are just, from the very first consultation at Deakin University, we found originally that it was more likely that the academics were going to drop a textbook completely than convert to an OER textbook. But that wasn't borne out by the time we finished the study. I think it just happened to be who we spoke to in the early days. So there was a mixture of people who were dropping texts altogether for a fully online experience versus, I think, predominantly lots of reading lists that use still book chapters and book sections, and some adopting of OER, open access reading lists, and full open platforms, so the NOBA platform for psychology and so on. So there was definitely some shifts in the notion of what the role was of readings, and some disciplines were still hanging on to texts, and particularly foundational texts. So definitely that is the case. And Jill's talking about some possibilities for this being tokenistic and how to avoid that. And the report, which will be forthcoming from this project, digs into that very much. So both students and staff were talking about how important it was to not just ameliorate things, but to change systems and to transform systems. And so there was a lot of talk about the commercial publishing model and the problems with that more generally, and the whole cycle between research going lockdown and then not being able to use that in teaching. And there was a lot of conversations about needing to go from diversity as the pictures to whose knowledge is represented and so on. So there is definitely depths and layers and ways of doing things meaningfully, and ways to do it checking boxes. And there's some language and terms in the report, I think, to help people pick between that. Yeah.
Thanks for that, Sarah. A couple of questions that seem to be repeated is whether some of your materials are actually available. And I know myself that from Twitter, a couple of people have asked for that as well. If you'll be making, for example, your presentation widely accessible, or if there is a website that you could provide on Discord and we can disseminate wider, or even if the project has a website, because I think it's not just the Australian higher education that would benefit, but worldwide. There was also a comment from Paula Corti, who said that they are working on developing checklists to support some approaches with copyright license MOOCs, hoping this will also raise awareness, and probably putting together all these materials would help. We are kind of running short of time, but the conversation will be continuing on Twitter and Discord. And if there is no further questions, there is another comment from Jill, which is they've had some conversation about how we represent diversity without being tokenistic, particularly in resource targeting, and very much what you've said, really, Sarah. And I think it's just the start, the beginning of a big work, and your work, this project has come at a very good time, where we are reflecting on the whole, the next step and the next, how we are next seeing education the next 20, 50 years coming ahead. So
absolutely, I will publish. Thank you so much. The website's on the screen. We will be publishing the report. There will be lots of appendices. People are asking for the questions and the survey questions. We are working to get those out as part of that, but it has to go through the funder for checking first. So we will get there. People can ping me privately if they have an urgent need for that because of what they're prepping at the moment, but we will certainly be sharing plenty of examples as well in the appendices of people who have had a crack at this, and hope that it inspires others to just think deeply about not only the freedom of their texts in terms of the money, which is super important, but what it is that we're providing free access to exactly. Because if it's more racist and sexist views, I don't think that's a benefit anyone is talking about. So yeah, we can definitely just move the sort of lever over on that one, I think. Yeah. Thank you so much, everyone, for your comments.
Thank you very much, Sarah. You actually, I know you joined us. It's evening for you right now. And thank you, everyone who's been posting comments and suggestions. And we'll take the conversation further on Discord and Twitter and wider, even via email and everything else. Thank you very much, and bye.
Thanks.
Nom nom nom.